Hi, I'm Andre J, and welcome to this month's episode of the Patreon wage labor video. Today we are going to talk about practical video feedback effects. And what I mean by practical is that we're going to use sort of physical stuff like mirrored plastic and orbs and glass and different kinds of junk and trinkets to kind of like manipulate our video camera feedback. But yeah, first, before we do that, just a little bit of spiel about the Patreon stuff. This video, like all of my Patreon wage labor videos, was voted on by Patreon people. Anyone who is a paying member of Patreon can vote. Anyone who's been a member of Patreon for more than 6 months gets to make suggestions on what sort of videos I make. For now, because the numbers aren't very high for Patreon, it's only videos. If we can get up to say $600 a month, then I'll be able to start making more like of those sort of in-depth mixer guide, the gear guide video things that I did a couple of. I think I did 3 before, so I would do, if we get up to 600, which we could possibly do in the next month, then I'll make the MX1 mixer guide, the Videonics MX1 mixer guide that I sort of promised for a while. What other numbers do we got? If we get up to 800 a month, I will put in save states for the wave pool and whatnot, and every month we stay at 800 after that. I would add save states to artificial life, spectral mesh, temporal vortex, etc., auto waves, so on and so on. What else do Patreon people get? If you're a Gravity Waves user, I'll be giving out save states presets for Gravity Waves on a semi-regular basis, only for people who have been subscribing for more than 6 months, because the goal, of course, is to get people to keep subscribing and not just sign up for 1 month and then quit, because that's what a lot of people do. If you give away stuff like that. And if we get up to 1,200 a month, then I would do things like work on the desktop Video Waves suite, make that all much easier to install, figure out how to make one-click installer, and then put Gravity Waves in the desktop suite. So that's 1,200 a month. Yeah, the overall goal is to have a Patreon which offers regular money to fund development and edutainment videos like this on like a long-term ongoing basis, so that it's not just for me just like a constant hump of like trying to sell tickets to classes and trying to sell video synthesizers to like even get by on a month-to-month basis. So that's the Patreon spiel. This is also going to go in the playlist of video feedback techniques, which I don't think I've made one of those in a long time. Probably, if anybody just watches the playlist of the video feedback techniques, like start to finish, which actually very, very few people actually do, according to the numbers that I look at on YouTube. There's a very steep drop-off after the first 10 minutes of the first video, let alone when you get to video like 24 or something. People are probably going to be like, wow, what the fuck happened to this guy? What happened to that like skinny twerp? Yeah, it hasn't even been that long, but you know, people change. Life goes on. Okay, so practical feedback. Okay, I took a little break there to put up some blackout fabric, as it turns out that it's daytime. And I don't have a basement studio anymore, so I actually need to think about sunlight. But yeah, before we get too deep in the weeds here, let me just explain what I'm doing here and the basic kind of hardware I'm using to like work with. So I've got this tiny camera. I've been really getting into trying to figure out what analog video cameras are sort of like still on the market and exist that you can like buy that someone's manufacturing. And it's kind of tricky because the main people making analog cameras that sort of exist in like a convenient housing like this that actually has like mounts, normal mounts on it, and is like kind of like practical, and as you can see, pretty tiny. Got a normal C-mount lens thing on it. The main people manufacturing stuff like this is like for like sort of like industrial and scientific usage. Like this thing comes from an AliExpress seller that like does stuff for like microscopes for like soldering tiny things, I'm guessing. So it like would come with like really like zoom in lenses and like a little thing that stands up so you can have like, and of course you want to have analog for that because you don't want to have any latency when you're doing shit like that. And then, so this is called a Mintron, I believe. Mintron is the company that makes these. And yeah, I don't really have any great links to send anybody yet about this. I'm trying to compile better knowledge about stuff for suppliers where it's like, because a lot of times I'll like, because what I did with this is like, oh, a while back I did like a workshop and I shared this information with a bunch of people, and then like literally every single one of the cameras got like sold in a second and they didn't restock very quickly. So I'm like trying to avoid situations like that because I want to figure out what is someone who's still actively engaged in like manufacturing and selling these. So, and also stuff that's maybe $50 or less, because it's like sort of a thing at a certain point when you're just like after maybe like 15 years of like messing around with camera feedback stuff, you don't really want to just be like doing the whole thrift store thing constantly of just like, all right, here's another fucking gigantic RCA VHS camera with a proprietary power supply and a proprietary video output. And then just like, oh yeah, and it's going to fucking, the sensor's gonna burn out in like 1 year or something. So then you have this gigantic thing, and you get really into it, and you use this stuff, and then you find out it's not really replicable. So replicability is like something I'm getting much more interested in, and trying to figure out what is the sort of like sustainable model for doing like analog camera feedback that isn't just like, yeah, maybe try to find a handy cam, try to find one of those where like it doesn't power off every 10 minutes or something, all that bullshit. So yeah, but yeah, tiny sort of industrial supply analog cameras is sort of where I'm at in terms of like what I'm most interested in using. The other thing worth noting is Tamron lenses. I'm using these Tamron lenses with like 3.5 to 8 millimeter like focal length. And they come with iris, focus, and zoom, and they all usually have some pretty nice lens distortion on them, like not like total fisheye, but like it does kind of like, if we try to match it up, we're gonna see, yeah, there's some definite lens curvature you're seeing there, which I kind of like. I don't want like full fisheye usually, but I do like a little bit of lens distortion because that gives like some pretty interesting, like, keeps things moving. Makes it hard to have like the really static stuff, the static blob. And then it works really nice when you start to do rotational feedback. So that's the camera. The monitor I'm using, it's actually not super important that I'm using this exact monitor. The main thing that's important about the monitor that I'm using is that I took it off the stand and I'm having it laying face up. Because I found to do sort of like practical feedback effects when you're working with like a lot of mirrors and prisms and shit like that, what's really nice to have is like be able to like set things down on top of it. Like, so there we go. I just put that compact disc on there. Or, yo, 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 here is a cube. Cube. Cool things about cubes. Stuff like that, and you'll really see what makes a difference when we start getting into the mirrored stuff. So yeah, just any sort of LCD TV with analog input that allows you to take the bass off is nice. The only sort of drawback to this is you need to have some sort of distribution amp involved in order to like split the signal, so you can split the signal somewhere else. But you know, most mixers have like some sort of distribution amp thing built into them. And you can actually usually find like pretty decent DAs out there for pretty cheap. So that's not like the biggest like hassle in the world. But yeah, just 1 second to talk about this monitor too. It is a Dell studio monitor. So it's got like it's 1080p. It's got a nice upscaler. It's got good controls on it. Pretty nice like real color, good upscaling stuff on it. I've had like a bunch of these Dells, and every time I see one at like a junk shop, I pick up another one because pretty good to have in the grand scheme of like LCD TVs, LCD like studio monitors. Like Dell ones are pretty fucking tight. So that's the sort of hardware stuff I'm working with. And then for just take a brief moment and show kind of like the other things I've got here. I've got like this, this is like mirrored plastic found at a junk shop. So, you know, it just like, it's the kind of stuff like, it's similar to aluminized mylar. I think a lot of people who have taken the IRL classes I've done know that I talk a lot about working with mylar, aluminized mylar, which is like this kind of stuff. But of course the mylar thing is you kind of do have to like make it rigid somehow. So the nice thing about the plastic, the mirrored plastic, is that it's already fairly rigid, but not super rigid, and that you're able to kind of like you don't have to like mount it onto anything in order to start doing like mirrored feedback stuff with it. So yeah. So this is, just bought it in like a giant roll and just cut pieces out to fit. What else do we have? We've got stupid little light blob things that I got from like a one of those like LED party lamp things. We've got some optical glass prisms. Got all kinds of, this is a really coarse diffraction grating thing pulled out of like a projector. Here's some more optical glass in like kind of like a what do you call it, a pentagon shape. We got the good old-fashioned flying asshole wipe, the aluminized mylar tube toilet paper, and yeah, various other sorts of like glass baubles. Anything that kind of like light can move through and be disturbed in some way is pretty cool to use for feedback. And it's not really just about feedback here, but about like what are kind of like some different ways you can sort of like work with just the pure simplicity of like interrupting photons instead of having to like be concerned about like what's going on with your video signal. Because you can make like, even if you're just interested in like making sort of like abstract patterns in general, you can just like very easily and very simply work with textures just by like interrupting the light flow in a way that would be like much more difficult if you were trying to like do this with like pure signal based stuff. And I think a lot of people don't really like think about this as like the first thing to try, because like, you know, a lot of people get into this world and they talk about gear. What's the gear? What's the mixer you got? What kind of camera do you got? What kind of like glitch processor do you got? Et cetera, et cetera. What kind of modular things do you have? And then sort of like, so you sort of lose track of the fact that if you're doing any kind of camera feedback stuff and any sort of analog signal, like one of the easiest things you can do is just plug a camera into it somewhere and use that as a source. But how can you like be generating like different kinds of like textures, motions, and performable synthesized patterns just using like very practical light stuff. And then a lot of it is just like very simple trash, like this sort of like bubble wrap stuff, which you can use sort of as like a very like smooth filter. You get this kind of like repeating texture, and it's gonna like diffuse the light just enough that you get this kind of like weird strobing pattern. Let me try to rotate it. Oh yeah, the other nice thing I like about this kind of setup where you got like the camera pointing down is that you don't really need too much extra stuff to do like interesting rotation things. Um, the practicality of doing this in like a lot of settings, I'm gonna keep this in my hand pretty much the whole time so it's easy for me to move things around. Oh, there goes my light thing. I'll make sure to gaff that up. Okay. But another thing you can do to keep something like this mounted, if you're working with these tiny security cameras and you've got like a permanent setup that you like to work with, of course you can just get the little security camera mount things and kind of like put it on the ceiling, and they make them so you can kind of like put it down, angle it, and point it right down. Otherwise, something like this, the magic arm, is pretty handy. It's just got a clamp on one hand and like a camera mount on the other. So when I had like the studio in Brooklyn, I'd have one of these set up with like pointed down at like a feedback screen like this at all times, and you just kind of like move it around and you can kind of twist it. But actually, most of the time, if you have the camera fixed like this, it's easier to move your screen around, and you can actually like kind of like tilt it, move it up and down, put it at weird angles, stuff like that. So yeah, practicality is what we're talking about here. So here's one cool thing you can do with this kind of setup that doesn't even require too much in the way of anything extra, is you can work with these really kind of like oblique angles, things that you wouldn't really think to do with like the normal sort of like camera feedback setting. You can see I'm getting these really cool moire patterns here by working at incredibly oblique angles. I pretty much just have the camera on the like sitting on top of the screen itself, and then I'm just kind of like tilting it just enough to get like a bit of feedback going on, and there we go, and we get that really nice moire. Of course, having the camera sensor be so close to the pixels, and the fact that this is a pretty nice upscaler, means we're going to get really crispy, nice moire like this. Of being able to really kind of like accentuate and paint the moire. I should have probably gotten some more blackout fabric for this screen, but for my other window, which is reflecting onto the screen right now. But then you can see what happens at a certain point. We're going to get to strobing. So I'm going to like get it reset here, grab the moire, and then just kind of like lean into that. But yeah, you can also just like do that straight up point. You don't really want to do that. That's going to get really stroby. This one's going to have a bit of a strobe warning on it. But yeah, what are we going to start with? So let's start with just sort of like little like practical filters. So a lot of this stuff, the little like textured filter things, this one in particular I pulled out of a projector. So when you take apart like older like 3 LCD projectors, it's pretty interesting. You find out a lot about how like the light works in there. But you also can get like a lot of interesting like patterned optical glass out of it as well. And you can usually find if you manage to get the whole thing taken apart, you can get a dichroic, one of those dichroic cube things right out of where the lens is. But yeah, so this is sort of like it's slightly angled, it's slightly curved, and it's going to kind of like pixelate things, basically, because like each little bit inside of the thing is going to like, if I put it down, you can kind of like see it more clearly on the screen. Maybe we just do this. I mean, I guess you could see it the whole time. So it's sort of like offering like a pixelated blob of everything that's going on. So if we put it right up against it and just kind of like get it to like this sweet spot right here, this is pretty much a practical pixelator right here. So you can point it at like any sort of like video source any sort of thing. If you're doing like a rescan, you could use this to pixelate a rescan, and just kind of like have it sort of sitting at like different lengths away from the screen. So let me pull out a little bit of the light here, so that we don't get too crazy. And then let me just open up the iris a little bit on this one until we get to a point, because I don't want it to be super stroby. Because this one's got like a little bit of like auto exposure things, but you can get this kind of cool thing. Like here's a nice moment right here where we've got like a bit of like there's just kind of like enough of it like outside of the pixelating to like keep it from strobing too hard. And then we get to this certain point and we've got like basically a practical pixelate thing here. So here's a pretty nice one. Put that aside. Oh yeah, dichroic stuff can be pretty nice. Here's like a little dichroic prism thing, a very tiny one. It's better to have something a little bit larger. But you can use this to sort of like, it's going to filter out. So what dichroic glass does, or dichroic film on glass, is going to basically reflect one kind of light, one color. So usually these are for like when they're used inside of the 3 LCD projectors. What they're doing is sort of like taking like the 3 LCDs, which have a red, green, and a blue thing on it, and then combining that into one full spectrum light beam that then gets like put through the lens and turned up. But with this, you can kind of like, so if I just hold this up and I'm not doing feedback, you can see that what it's doing is like, it's reflecting, it's basically like looks like a CMYK or a CMY reflection and filter. So we're getting like straight ahead is sort of like bluish and greenish, but then on the sides as we tilt it around, you can see like the reflections kind of like shift around. So these are pretty nifty to use, because you can basically use them to sort of bring in, because it's reflecting certain things, what it's doing is bringing in stuff at different angles into the feedback. So it's doing this kind of like strange like blend mode thing. So depending on like how your camera is angled and what else is in the room, you could use this probably with like maybe say you had like a cage setup of like three monitors that were all split from the same signal, and you had this kind of camera pointed at one in the middle, and it's sort of gonna like blend in like different bits of each monitor. So that could be pretty crazy. Oh, did I just close the iris completely? I did. So that's dichroic glass. Probably better to like have something a little larger. I don't know, I think I lost my large dichroic glass prism at one of the workshops I did. So I'm gonna have to like find and take apart another large projector one of these days to get a good one back. What else do we got in here? So here's a thing. This is just like a chunk of like plastic that I pulled off of like an LED party light thing. Really, really stupid. But like a lot of stupid things, it's made to sort of like make light go like blobby. So we can just do this kind of like put it right up next to the lens and then just kind of shift it. We're not exactly gonna get like the sort of like textured feedback, crazy wormy feedback you're accustomed to. What you're gonna get is this sort of like shifting light as it moves around. So it's like I've done a couple of like classes where we talk about like what can you do with like light. It's diffraction, refraction, and diffraction, refraction, diffusion, and reflections are the main things you do with light. And if I was smarter and I was better at planning things, I probably would have organized this thing around the diffraction, refraction, reflection, and diffusion. But you know what? My intelligence is highly overrated, and my ability to prepare is, who knows? Who knows where we're at? But this is the kind of cool thing that you can do with just like weird blobby plastic. You get this sort of like interesting breathing texture, and just like doing slight shifts to like sort of move the light around. And of course, if you zoom it out a little bit, we're going to get to that strobing thing here. But these things can be nice too because they just kind of like hold light and move it around. So like, oh, I'm losing the feedback. Let's bring it back. If you don't have anything with auto exposure, having just a little bit of something you can kind of like dip in there to seed the feedback can be very, very helpful. So that's a little plastic blob. Another fun thing we can play with is orbs. So this is optical glass orb. You can see what happens if we just like use this. It's like reversing what's going on. So it has kind of like a lensing effect. It's got a lot of scuff marks on it. This orb has been through a lot. So we can think about, instead of just like going in like super random, we can think about, so it reverses things. So let's point the camera at this upside down, and then notice what happens when you kind of like bring this in here is it makes it right side up again. So we have the sort of combination of like flipping. Try to get this positioned kind of nicely. So we get a flip. And then we have this sort of like strange orbed P&P thing that like makes the feedback more stable again. So that's kind of strange. And then we just see what happens. We get into this really sweet spot here. And now let's start to rotate the camera. We got that really kind of crazy distorted spiral happening in the center here. Yeah, that's nice. Try to like slowly zoom it in. Of course, the closer you get on this, the less kind of like detail you have. So there's kind of a sweet spot where you're like a little bit farther away, and you can get some of the detail of what's going on inside the orb. But you also want to have stuff happening outside the orb too, which can like help sort of like prevent it from just like being total orb blob. So you can have total orb blob too. It's kind of cool, but like it's a little hard for this one because of the auto exposure, but you get some pretty interesting moire artifacts this way with like complete orb blob. That's pretty weird. Alright, so that's glass orb. That's a really fun one. Working with little prisms can be pretty nice too. So here's this is a plastic plexiglass prism. And of course, you can use these little triangular prisms to do kind of a kaleidoscope thing. It's kind of hard with this one in particular, it seems like. What's more interesting to me to work with this is just kind of like set it at an interesting angle because it's going to reflect some of the feedback up at you and kind of like do sort of like this like weird reflected feedback. wait till, oh, there's a sweet spot. It's picking up some of the lights on the walls here. Just kind of like set it right here, put it here, and then kind of like move it around until you see something interesting going on. Wow, this is super scratched up. And it should be noted here, this lens on this is really, really scratched up, and the monitor here is pretty scratchy too. So there we go. So here's a pretty cool bit where we're getting a bit of that feedback through the prism. That's pretty weird. But yeah, to do nicer sort of kaleidoscope stuff, it's good to have like some optical glass, have like a larger optical glass. So you can see just using this optical glass up against the lens is going to give you some pretty cool kaleidoscoping things. So this is just pointed not at the screen, and then we get it back down and pointed at the screen, and then you're going to find it's a little tricky to get it to a point where it's not just going to be like super spazzy, and this is where having something without auto exposure is probably nice. But yeah, just kind of like messing around with the angles and stuff until you get an interesting point. Usually you want to have a little bit of something which is not feedback in there too. Kind of makes a difference to like how sort of like weird it's gonna be. Yeah, I'm gonna try to get this more straight on, I guess. There we go. Straight on. It's a pretty interesting shape. There we go. So you get this sweet spot where you get like a little bit of kind of like P and P kaleidoscope happening, but the feedback going kind of normally around it. That's what I'm talking about. Woo! Other kinds, so that's sort of like using the three-sided prism to offer you that sort of like three-sided symmetry. It's going to look hexagonal, but it's only three things reflecting. Cool thing you can do is just put mylar, aluminized mylar, inside of like a toilet paper tube, and then put the lens inside of that, and what you get is infinite symmetry. So it's going to reflect things kind of infinitely. You could probably be better than I was about like making the seam not quite so visible. I think you can kind of see the seam on there. But here's just aluminized mylar doing feedback off of that, and you can see the symmetry is kind of like this warped, and I can even warp it a little bit more by just kind of squeezing it. It's a warped continuous symmetry going on. Very practical effect. I'm gonna try to keep this video a little bit shorter than like the usual ones I make, so I'm not gonna get too in the weeds in any one of these particular ones. Other kinds of optical glass. So I've got this optical glass triangle here. I'm gonna kind of use that and work with this kind of weird angle stuff here, because we're getting reflections inside of the optical glass itself. So getting sort of an interesting kind of, so I want to do this sort of feedback inside of the pyramid. That's pretty weird. Try different angles with this as well. Just point it down like that. What we're kind of doing here is this is reflecting multiple things, not just the feedback. So we're getting kind of like little slices of feedback in there and just little slices of whatever else is going on inside of the room. So you point it down, you can't actually balance it like this. We point it down like that. Let's do like a little bit of a, try to get it a little bit more centered. Kind of do rotations like that. Pretty strange chasms. Yeah, let's just point it outside. So I'm just pointing this at the side. So here if I point it at the base, you get this kind of thing where you have the it's not a kaleidoscope, it's just like reflecting different slices, and the different slices are bouncing around inside of this. Point it back at the screen, and you can see you're only going to get a little bit of the screen in there. There's only a couple of slices here that are like actually sort of like the straight on slices. Most of the rest of this is grabbing stuff that's like all sort of like at right angles to me. And then you go on the side here, and we're going to get more of a like a direct throughput, but not, still not straight. So that's this pyramid motherfucker here. And then of course square. So you have the square. Square doesn't do that much until you like get it at like an angle. So just the square, and it looks like I got some wax all over this square, so it's going to be extra dirty. We just use a square on there like that. Not really a ton going on there. It doesn't really seem to distort anything. But if we go kind of at an angle here, you can see how it distorts things on the sides. So maybe the thing to do is kind of go like this. All right, the thing to do is put the pyramid on top of the square. And then put the orb on top of the pyramid. Not really going to balance there, but we got a lot of weird light stuff sort of moving around in here. Another really cool one is just if you have like glass. So here's some optical glass. These little angles, these little beveled angles on the edges of it, that's where the really interesting things come in here. So what you can do with that is if you hold it at like, you've got a little beveled angle, very, very slight, and then we kind of get that at the right point. There we go. Now we've got like a little bit of fractalizing going on. So I'm holding everything kind of at like oblique angles here. I'm going to try to get it to a point where it's not going to do auto exposure. Yeah. So we got a little bit of like fractalizing happening in here. You can just kind of like, let me do some rotational stuff here. Try to get it kind of centered. All right, do your thing. And then we'll kind of bring this in, introduce this kind of on the sides. And then start to bring the angle out like that. And move this up a bit. So that's what you can do with this kind of like beveled glass stuff. And now that brings us to mirrors. So you can do this with regular mirrors too. I find it somewhat practical and kind of more fun to work with these bendy sorts of mirror things that you can get with the plastic mirror stuff. The reason for that is you can kind of like, so a normal mirror you can just do like, let's see, make sure this is kind of pointed straight on here. Oop, we'll lose the video. Oh yeah, I keep closing the aperture. Let's get this pointed straight on here. And then you can just do like pretty normal kind of mirror thing, just kind of hold it right in the middle. And now we've got like a mirror of what's going on the feedback. You can do kind of like the pretty normal stuff. But if you've got a bendy mirror, then you can kind of hold it like that. And then you've got this weird kind of thing where like you can kind of like curve it, wiggle it around, and that changes up. So you don't just get like the right edge, the right angle kind of mirror thing happening, but you have like weird curved distortions. So you can kind of see that really clearly right here, how distorted you can get. And you can kind of like change the angle when you're just free holding the camera like this. You can kind of like change this angle too. So you can hold it at like really weird oblique angles and you get stuff that you wouldn't get otherwise from just having like a rigid mirror. So you can see when you get the angle in the mirror right, you don't see the mirror at all in the feedback, like the sort of like physical thing getting in the way. You just see the reflection. That's pretty nice. Ooh. You find a really good spot to hold the camera, and then you just start to move the mirror around and curve it a bit. So you can get like this asymmetrical kind of symmetry going on too. It's not the perfect kind of like cheese ball symmetry you get from like the just using like a V4 or whatever. You get this weird kind of warped symmetry. And you can kind of just like wiggle the symmetry too. Wow. So I'll try just pointing the camera at the mirror. So this is what happens if you just like shoot the mirror itself. Let's see if I can get myself in there. So you can see what it's doing to the reflections. It's very, very warped, wiggly reflections. That's some weird mirror stuff. Wiggly mirrors. Curved, like super warped thing. Using my body here, as you can see. Oh, that's really weird. Probably make like a big tube out of this too. I'm sure that would be pretty fun stuff. I farted a couple of times during this shooting. I don't know if the farts are actually going to make it through onto the microphone, but I just thought I'd let you know if you made it to the end. There's a little bonus treat. Woo. So that brings us to the end of this Patreon wage labor video for the month of April 2024. If you'd like to vote on what gets made for my May video, you can join the Patreon. On the poll results, we'll put up the poll in like a week or so. Yeah, and if you're not on my Patreon, I guess that's cool too. I mean, you can just watch whatever I put out. I'm still not gonna paywall the YouTube stuff, which I think some people do. And I guess I don't know what do other people do with Patreons, like sample packs and stuff like that, or just like I don't know, T-shirts, or I know there's a big one that a lot of people do where it's like you get to have like a private call or something at some point. I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna do any sort of like pay $25 a month and you can like call me. Yeah, that's not really my thing. I like to keep a bit of distance here and there. But yeah, I don't really know. Yeah, just trying to figure out how to keep funding development and keep this whole video business thing afloat here. Woo! And maybe be able to like buy a trailer before the end of the year so I can have a portable mobile office. That would be pretty cool. Can have like an office that I run out of the national forests. That's a goal right there. But yeah, that's the end of this video. Thanks a lot to everyone who has supported this so far. And as always, have fun.